Tabanga will soon remove itself from the ground.
You mean this wooden zombie's going to uproot itself from the earth? Your grandfather must have been quite a storyteller.
Please, Professor, if this one is like the other Tabanga, you must destroy it at once. I beg you. Pull up the root so it will die before it murders everyone.
Norgu, what you fear is scientifically impossible.
You know what? I have an eerie feeling that this thing knows what we're saying.
Frightquake, hot as the jungle, cold as the tomb, a double demon show, twin screamers of science fright. Happy Halloween, guys and ghouls. This is your host, Ian Garcia. With me is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
And this is Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies in which me and my father, more or less, we watch classics of horror, madness, fiendish gore, just basically garbage. Just garbage and trash from the bygone classic era of low-budget filmmaking that seem to basically permeate the American landscape, which is more or less dead now. Basically, what this podcast is a way of trying to engage with these classic B movies, and sometimes not even classic. Sometimes they are just obscure and people just don't remember them at all, but to try to engage them in a way that appreciates the occasional depth and nuance of certain films, as well as, you know, the very particular ways that they impacted their audiences and were very much a staple of the pop culture diet for millions of American young children. Dad, what year were you born in?
1951.
1951. So I want you to first, let's just start off, and I want you to tell me, what do you think was your first like deep impression of film? What is the first memory that you have, or even just the one that sticks out in your mind that really, like, it really impressed upon you?
Well, I think the first one, I'm trying to think, probably was King Kong, which used to be shown, the original King Kong that was shown often at night, usually like 11 o'clock on usually New York broadcasting stations would do it. Sometimes they would be played through the week. They'd be every night in case you missed it or wanted to see it again. The one that really sticks out in my mind is my first impact, the one that impacted me the most. In fact, I couldn't see it all the way through because I was too young and I was too excitable about it. And that was The Wolfman with Lon Chaney and the Lon Chaney Jr. in the original film with Claude Rains. Just watching that movie alone, I was so excited that I actually had to go to bed simply because my mother wouldn't let me watch it beyond a certain point. And then gradually, as I got older, only about a year or so, then I was able to sit through. The other opportunities that came about were many of these films are actually shown at the 5 o'clock hour. And some, again, on some of the New York stations would play these. We have to remember there are only a few stations back then. There were 3. These movies were sort of like the mainstay between the real regular programming that were more meaningful to adults.
They were kind of like filler. These were the things that the kids could sit down and watch, and they could just burn themselves out.
Right, because right after these movies were over, essentially the American flag came on, and then the test pattern came on, indicating that the network is shutting down, which is something you don't see anymore. So a lot of these movies were put dead to last. Maybe someone else, like some religious person like Bishop Sheen, would come on like after the, it's kind of funny in a way, juxtapositioning some horror trash movie, and then the Reverend Bishop Sheen would come on and talk about God and Jesus and everything. It was kind of interesting to follow it.
I guess that definitely is like, and it sort of speaks to, obviously, a lot of the movies that we are going to be watching. A lot of them we're going to try to consider them, as far as this podcast, we're going to try to consider them in a relatively broad context. We're going to try to see them through the lens of how they were originally presented. For instance, this first episode that we're doing, we're going to be covering a Allied Artists double feature, which is these two films, From Hell It Came and The Disembodied, which are two horror films, one of them more science fiction than horror, which were paired together by the distribution company Allied Artists and basically toured around America in the manner that was fashionable back then. Oftentimes, that's only part of the story of these films, because the life that these films have after their initial run, and certainly at a time before home video, before the way that we're watching them now, which is like, From Hell It Came is now, Warner Brothers has now released it in this beautiful Blu-ray packaging. Like, it doesn't have much in the way of special features, but it's certainly the best that this film has ever been presented since it probably was first seen. Whereas these films were released in 1957, and you being born in 1951, you likely were not in the theater when you saw this film, and you were probably, it's probably exactly that situation of you staying up late into the evening to catch whatever was going to be on, that late night hour.
Right. The more I can remember, the movies that I did see were probably starting in 58, when I was able to go to the drive-in and see things like The Flying Mantis.
The Deadly Mantis.
Deadly Mantis, where it was in that one, and movies of that type. They're a little later, so I was old enough to go there. The other ones I pretty much saw from the TV, because they came immediately on TV and are broadcasted on TV, like as I mentioned before, usually through the New York stations. Because I'm in Trenton, so it was generally out of New York where these movies would play.
And I think that's interesting because, that's definitely also part of the story of B movies, is that, it's like, obviously before home video, when these movies were, it's kind of hard to imagine, especially in an age where now we're even past the point of home video. Now we're in the age of streaming, when so many of these films are now at basically the push of a button, where we can just rent them and watch them.
Not all of them, though, right?
Not all of them. Like,
some of them we're having difficulty getting, actually.
Yeah, there's still a pretty drastic problem in terms of preservation of these movies. And this is the thing that is really important for people to understand, is that as far as American filmmaking goes, and especially as far as the topics that this podcast is going to cover, very many of these movies were not even major studio films. They were very much independently produced, often by small startup companies that, were attempting to make money off of very, very, very thin margins. And as a result, like, a lot of these movies were definitely, produced and exhibited with the mentality of you were going to show them once, or more or less once, and then that was the money you were going to make off of them.
But I think you're going to mention this, is that many actors, not all of them, many actors cut their teeth on these movies and went on to be into some really good television programming, again, which was probably starting in the 60s, like The Untouchables, things like that, or the Twilight Zone, Rod Serling's Twilight Zone. These people were able to get these, some large parts, not bit parts, but large parts in these series. And so it isn't all, it provided fertile ground for some actors to rise up and to get into better type of genres of film, and also television programming. I
think, and especially when it comes to television, and that's definitely a big part of the story, because once the thing that you're alluding to, where, this idea that you stay up late into the night and you could catch some just random just trashy, very cheaply produced movie, whether it was a classic Universal or RKO horror movie, such as, like you said, King Kong or Dracula or The Creature from the Black Lagoon, or in the case of these films, the Allied Artists, the American International Pictures, the Samuel Z. Arkoff Productions. These were obviously not major studios. They were even further to the margins of what was basically independent filmmaking at the time. But what happens with television is that you see the greater profitability that these companies realize that they can make by selling bulk packages of these huge libraries of low-budget movies that they have to television syndicators for the specific purpose of showing them to create advertising.
Right, because there's
revenue.
Advertising revenue. There is some advertising revenue that comes in with these movies.
Yeah. So a lot of these movies gain a new life in these conditions, and we'll get into a lot of that because a lot of it is not so much. A lot of it gets into the sort of anecdotal history, at least for one of these films, the background of one of these films, From Hell It Came. But
there's another, before you go on to that, there's another issue I want to point out, and maybe some of the listeners don't understand this, depending on your cultural background, but being raised Roman Catholic, the papers will often put out these movies, and they would be listed. They would be listed as an A1 movie, which is morally unobjectionable for everybody, so that's fine. You can all see it.
Right, and this was actually a. You're
All
talking
these
about
movies,
the Catholic,
yeah.
I don't know the specific name, but the Catholic Church in America did actually have a nationally published.
Yeah, and it's really funny. I think it was, and it wasn't in the Catholic papers.
This was before there was any official ratings body. This was before there was already the Hayes production code. There was already the conglomerated.
Right, and most
rating,
of these movies, like From Hell It Came, and also Disembodied, these were B movies, which means you had to haggle with your parents to figure out whether you could stay up and watch these. So
because the archdiocese says this is not good for your soul.
And then you worry about whether you commit a sin because you're going to watch these movies, which it doesn't. So there's additional layer, which also delayed the opportunity for young people like myself to see these movies because of the fact that, don't get me wrong. That's
the plus of showing them so late at night. Because while obviously a lot of these movies were expressly produced by these individuals with the target audience being the youngest, the impressionable, the people with the most leisure time and the most income, once those things migrate to television, you see this very interesting change where it's like they're being shown so late at night that, yes, the core audience of young people is still there, but a lot of the people who are discovering and rediscovering these movies ends up being this cult of much older people who just have these kind of almost a morbid fascination with them. And it's interesting that you get into like how they had that these tiers that we associate with films, whether it's A picture or B picture or C picture, these weren't just classifications of the budgets of these films. No. There was often an explicit moral connotation associated, where if you're saying that something is a B movie, you're not just saying that it's a cheaply and quickly produced film, you're implying that there's something transgressive about it. There's something potentially badly
that turns out
immoral about
just
it.
The fact that you have a tree monster, for example, that alone, and that you have witch doctors and things right there. Well, that's an abomination.
Witchcraft but even something as simple as just like romance outside of the context of marriage.
Right.
Even something as simple as innuendos implying relationships, or in the case of the Disembodied, implications of miscegenation, of sexual and romantic partnership across racial lines.
Exactly. Yes.
And I guess that'll be another pervading motif of this series, is that I really want to stress that even as I go in with good faith of calling these movies garbage or trash or puerile, I want to make it absolutely clear that I say that with total love and a conviction that there's often aspects of these movies that are uniquely reflective either of an individual artist's vision or of American society as a whole that really warrants us to look at them and see that, if anything, it's because they are so explicitly gratuitous and explicitly exploitative of just honing down the entire economics of filmmaking into the distilled things of what can draw the most eyes to the theater and put most butts in seats, that makes them very amenable to so many different ways of engaging with them critically and kind of unpackaging them and realizing that sometimes that maybe, in some weird way, the conservative moral authorities and the guards of vice at the time, maybe they did have a point, that these movies were transgressive or subversive in a way that they're imputing, like, these ideas that are somewhat counter to or subversive of dominant trends in American ideology. Let's get right into it with the first half of this double feature, which again was distributed by Allied Artists began its run on August 25th in 1957. The double bill was From Hell It Came and The Disembodied. The first film...
I didn't realize that they were double billed. In this, when they were released, they were double billed?
They were released, yeah.
And obviously, drive-in or whatever? Or...
I guess we should say, the only... I guess the question is, why are we covering these films particularly?
Right, because they were double billed, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the reason that I decided to cover it is, being your son... There is this very, obviously not all boomers and children of the 50s and the late 40s, not all of them have the same love of these movies that you have.
Right.
But it was a huge, but you definitely,
and my
there's
brother.
something there's
right.
some sort of hereditary disease that has been passed down from you to me, in terms of just because I think it's something we're going to talk about more and more in terms of it's one thing. This is not a podcast about movies that are so bad they are good. This is not a podcast about viewing these movies exclusively from the perspective of adults who approach them from a purely oppositional perspective of they're just cheap, detritus, and we shouldn't take them seriously. We really are going to try to harken back to that in the core audiences for these movies, that impressionable young person who, for you, it would have been a kid in the late 50s, early 60s, watching late night television and seeing this cheap, bizarre movie about a killer tree monster. And on the other hand, me being the second generation of these, basically just monster movie nerds, this second generation who gets passed down to them these impressions. And, I can remember, for you, King Kong was an incredibly influential film, but I remember my first major impression of a movie was Godzilla King of the Monsters. And I remember being I forget exactly what the context was of it. I think it might have been back when AMC, the TV channel, they used to do every Halloween, they used to do a monster-thon. And I remember you taped Godzilla King of the Monsters one night, and so I was able to see it. And I guess it just gets down to it that when you're a child and when you are in that unique and credulous position, it doesn't matter how cheap the special effects are. It doesn't matter how bad the acting is. It doesn't matter how little this plot may make sense. You are not yet in a position where, as an adult, that you're primarily reactive to whatever is stimulating you. You're still in this very nascent state where you just absorb these things. Right. And I think, so we're going to try to approach these things in good faith. But as far as From Hell It Came, the reason we're talking about this one is because I can even remember being a kid and, you would fairly often try to, like, you know, like whenever something, I can remember you like reading TV listings in like the local Trenton Times or the New York Times or whatever, and telling me, oh, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is going to be on, or oh, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms is going to be on. But like occasionally, like there again, it gets to the issue of preservation. There were just lots of films from your childhood that like were simply not available to me until the modern day, where we're now able to watch them.
Right.
And one of those movies was From Hell It Came, and it seemed like that movie did have a particular impression upon you, or else when you became an adult and had 3 kids, you wouldn't be like standing around a breakfast table.
Well, there's also like the mainstay of some of these, like you mentioned the small movie production companies, et cetera, et cetera. That's true. But in addition to that, there were small outfits of, like, out of Philadelphia. For example, Zachary with not Shock Theater, but Zachary and I forget his name, his program, but it may have been Shock Theater. There was also Shock Theater may have been something different. The idea is that Philadelphia isn't seen so much as being the center of where you have local or national distribution of these things. But at one time it was, and Zachary brought a lot of these films. Most of them were things like The Mummy, Frankenstein, things like that. And Zachary
these big package deals from big
and
studios that just said, but let's pawn off some of this.
You don't see that anymore. You don't see anything.
No, yeah, it gets back to
So local. What do you call those? Local.
I mean, public access, basically.
Right.
Like, this is the thing, is that, like, and again, these are things that, like, again, I would like to get into.
Local broadcasting, small companies that no longer exist.
Yeah, it's like, and that's another thing we're going to get into, is that, like, it's like, again, like, as much as it is fun, it is fun to just, like, sit at these films and enjoy the ballyhoo and just mock them, like, from the balcony. We really do, in order to understand them critically and historically, we really do need to understand these movies, not just their production, but their history of distribution in the context of a economic structure that just doesn't exist anymore.
But why doesn't it? For example, sci-fi. We have the sci-fi channel, right? Why isn't there...
who owns sci-fi? And this is the thing, is that like a lot of the reason these public access networks just disappeared is because a lot of them were just bought up by broader media.
I know, but then you lose the not importance, but then the diversity of what you show dramatically decreases according to the market pressures and also the changing tastes of the public. So we have to look at these things as you do with with your DVDs or by streaming. Which,
to say as well, is like even the ownership of a lot of these movies, again, a lot of it has just been suctioned up by just these massive multimedia conglomerates.
Yeah, and the other thing is that part that you miss is the fact that like any kind of broadcasted movie or whatever you want to call them, there's a vicarious enjoyment. So you can say, friend, did you see this? It was on. Did you see Zachary last night or with this movie?
Yeah, he showed some wild stuff last night, man.
So that's all lost now. Now you put a DVD in, but who's going to be watching other than you? You're no longer part of it. Why do people want to listen to, for example, commercial radio? Or where they play rock and roll or something? Because you have a DJ. What is the DJ's purpose? DJ's purpose is to make you feel part of a wider audience that's sharing that experience. And I think that's the problem with what has happened is that, don't get me wrong, this is not earth-shocking problems. I mean, there's more to... But I'm just saying that in terms of entertainment, I think that's lost as well.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. Like, these are intimately connected to conglomeration and just, again, as you put it, like, just the complete vacuuming of diversity out of people's ability to consume. And the other thing you hit upon, our ability to use that diversity of a consumption in order to engage with people socially.
Not only that, but also to teach people. For example, many of these films, as bad as they are, burgeoning people that want to go into film, college students, they can see that even a bad film can be made. And you look up the budgets. How much did it cost to make? What was the cost of Night of the Living Dead, or not whatever that was?
Which one?
the black and white film, was it $88,000 it cost to make, and it generated like 1.4 million when it first aired.
The budget is this is just wiki research, but the budget was $114,000. 30 million it made.
Yeah, it made a lot of money.
Yeah,
and that was a black and white.
Black
right?
and white. Yeah, very cheap, independently produced. Again,
but not
again,
a bad film.
No, absolutely not. And this is the thing: is that like it's like there's this.
What kind of film do you know does a ratio like that anymore? Between 110,000, whatever you said.
It does happen, but it happens very rarely
Right,
because
right.
now all the intellectual property is owned by a small handful of people who are always trying to exploit the widest margins possible and are just taking the hugest risks of the But anyway,
right,
we can
good.
All right, so. First half of this double bill, distributed by Allied artists, From Hell It Came. This is, the first half of this double bill is interesting because while both of these films were distributed by Allied Artists Pictures, which was an independent film production and distribution company, only the second film, The Disembodied, was also produced by Allied Pictures. Again, the first picture, From Hell It Came, is another one of these cases which frequently happened in the economy of B movies, especially during the late 50s, after the major studios basically, lost their monopolies, which, the 1948 Paramount decision basically made it so that movie production companies could not also own the chains of distribution. So suddenly you had millions of theaters in the country that were suddenly up for grabs, and what that also meant was that independent film producers suddenly...
was that for antitrust? Do you know?
Yeah, that was definitely, it was late in the game. It was 1948, but it was definitely part of,
But I remember RKO Theater here in Trenton.
Well, it might have kept the RKO name, but, the theater was probably not owned by
so
RKO.
So House on a Haunted Hill, for example, was that an RKO? Do you remember?
Well, that was a Universal Pictures film.
Okay.
So,
okay.
But the more important thing being that so with B movie production at this period of time, it was you basically had the major film studios who were primarily located in Hollywood, who handled all of the major films, and had basically by this point had more or less stopped producing what we now refer to as B movies, had more or less decided, it's no longer cost effective for us to produce these cheap movies in order to try to make a bigger bundle, because now we don't even control the chain of distribution. We don't even control the ability to just reap profits directly from the vendor. We now have to make deals with those vendors, which cuts our gains and cuts our profits. So we're just going to... So what we see in the 50s after 1948 is that B movies by major studios slowly get phased out, and a lot of the bulk of B movie making gets picked up by companies like Samuel Z. Arkoff Productions or Allied Artists or American International Pictures. They basically come to fill in these blanks. So those are the B movie studios. If you're going to see an Allied Artists or an American International Pictures motion picture, it's not like MGM or Fox or Warner Brothers, where yes, they have their A-list films, but they also have different tiers of films. Literally all you do is B movies. And especially with American International Pictures, their model of business was so rarefied that they would just think of a title and a premise first and then pay for poster concept art to be made first, and they would think of a cast first, and then they would only after they have the poster made make the script. So just B movie making. But then even lower than that, you have these startup companies that often sell their independently produced productions to these B movie distributors, and that's the case with From Hell It Came, which is produced by Milner Brothers Productions. The Milner brothers are the director Dan Milner and one of the co-producers Jack Milner, who also co-wrote the story for the movie. The Milner Brothers Productions literally only produced 2 films in 1957. One was From Hell It Came. The other was The Phantom from 10,000 Leagues, which was also distributed by Allied Artists. So there was probably some sort of deal that they made with distribution deal they made with Allied Artists. But what's interesting is that, like, if you look into, like, the filmography of these guys, Dan Milner was, you know, besides one 1935 crime movie called The Fighting Coward, and besides The Phantom from 10,000 Leagues, he didn't direct any films. He primarily worked as an editor. The screenwriter for the movie, Richard Bernstein, this was his very first screenwriting credit, and he had a very slow career afterwards. Dan Milner's brother, Jack Milner, again, not someone who primarily worked in directing or in writing or even in producing. He mostly worked in sound department and editing. So what you see is that these guys who... So it's weird to think, but in a way you have to wonder, is like, you know, okay, is this a movie that comes about really just because these enterprising, you know, sound editors and, you know, second string production people decide that, oh, we can make a little bit of cash doing this? Or is there a possibility that this was an authentic expression of, like, this is our chance, this is our way of breaking into the film industry and doing a really personal project? And I think, like, there's a way to look at From Hell It Came and say, okay, there's a little bit going on under the hood here. It seems like there's a little bit more personal that's going on that isn't totally tied to just the, you know, the low margin economics of B movies. Just, like, produce it quickly and cheaply and make a bunch of money off of it.
I guess the other thing to say, and this is probably getting off, but since we began this thing, is that in my recollection, maybe I'm wrong, these movies were some of the first times where you see children or young adults or teenagers that have their own microcosm of believing in each other. So I forget the name of the film where they're the Martians with the big heads and they have alcohol in their talons.
Invasion of the Saucermen?
And they stick into a cow and they make a cow drunk, and the drunk it falls over.
I've never seen this one.
Yeah, but no one believes them except they all know each other. And at the end, they shine their lights on they get their cars, because the teenagers drove cars.
Yeah,
I mean, what I'm trying to say, but that's not the only one.
That's an important thing.
There's Steve McQueen in the Blob. No one believes
that's
him
an important thing we can get into, and that's another thing. Like, you know,
that's a whole genre itself. What are the films, the B movies that had kids involved, or we say young adults, but maybe teenagers or people playing teenagers?
I think that gets into the sort of formulas of these films. Like, you know, you definitely, because besides just the economics of these films, you do notice very discrete cycles in terms of what is determined to be the most exploitable in a film. And there is a very distinct difference between the 50s in terms of what these stories were about. You know, in terms of they almost universally focused on middle-aged adults, particularly scientists and people in the military. Very simple, just the facts, ma'am, sort of dragnet style storytelling. Yes. Whereas by the late 50s,
you start getting more nuanced.
especially with the example you brought up of the Blob, suddenly it becomes realized, like, oh, there's a whole evolving youth culture that can become, that you can incorporate as an exploitable element of these movies.
Not exploitable, but just the fact it expands the repertoire of it's good movie making. It's now you made it more complicated.
Right. The formula gets run into the ground, and then here's a way to adjust it. We put teenagers, because what's scarier than a teen?
But one of the questions I have is, what drove what? Was it the creativity that required the teenagers come in? Or did the market people say, you know what, more kids are watching these movies than anybody else, maybe we should do some films? Or do you think it just came organically? That I
honestly think it's symbiotic. Like, I honestly don't think that you would get a movie like, you definitely would not get movies like The Blob, or even to a lesser extent like the giant Gila monster or something,
or Earth versus the Spider, right?
Or Earth versus the Spider, again,
the band, right?
Which is, it's like, yeah, but like, it's like the common denominator there is the emergence of rock and roll. And the emergence of the baby boom youth culture is that, like, this
counterculture,
the nascent counterculture.
You don't understand this.
Yeah.
You don't understand this when our town is being threatened by a
this
mass.
generational conflict becomes literally manifest in the form of this horrific apparition, which can only be defeated by the young people stepping up to the plate and the adults
and recognizing that.
The adults just getting right behind them. But From Hell It Came is definitely not a youth-oriented. It is very definitely in that sort of
scientist,
that classic mold of
Doctor.
Scientists and military men. So the plot of From Hell It Came, there are basically two establishing scenes. The very first two scenes of this movie are just huge exposition dumps. The very first scene is it depicts the execution of a South Seas island prince. And that's the other thing. This movie takes place on a South Sea island. Where in the South Seas this island is it the Maori? Is it the Philippines? You don't know, and it doesn't matter.
Well, it has to be close to it's close to where the testing grounds were, where Nagasaki was for the drop of the atomic bomb.
No, it's definitely closer to the testing grounds. Like there's definitely explicit allusions to the atomic bomb tests in the Bikini Atoll at the time.
So somewhere around there.
Anyway, there's somewhere around there. Yeah, like and obviously it's like, it's abysmally racist. There's just a total flattening of all geographical context. It's like the South Seas Islands, they might as well be Hawaii. It doesn't really matter. But there's the Aboriginal prince Chemo, who is played by a white guy named Greg Palmer. And that's the other thing. All of the indigenous people in this movie are played by white guys in brown face.
No, there are some. The women. Some of the women are.
Well, yeah, of course, some of the women are. Because, like, again, like, all right. So anyway, but so Chemo is the prince of this island, and his father has recently died. And what we learn from the first exposition dump is, as he's about to be executed by the evil witch doctor Tano, played by Robert Swan, it is revealed that his father has died of some disease, but it's revealed that the witch doctor has blamed the death of his father on what they refer to as the devil dust brought by the white men. And the devil dust is nuclear fallout from the thermonuclear testing that the American military has been conducting in the Bikini Atoll. And so Chemo is convinced that it had nothing to do with it, and that he basically, again, it's an exposition dump. He explains that, no, you're just doing this because you want to seize power. You're just the white people are here to help us with their modern medicine. I've seen it work. They tried their best. But Chemo gets executed by having a knife driven into his heart. And then we transition to the outpost of the American scientists, who are represented by Dr. William Arnold, played by Todd Andrews, and Professor Clark, played by John McNamara? Yeah.
McNamara.
John McNamara.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get another huge exposition dump in which it is explained to us that in rather bleakly comic and horribly racist terms, that yes, there was an atomic bomb test, but a freak hurricane that nobody could have predicted just blew all this fallout to the island. And these doctors and scientists have basically been sent there as missionaries, more or less.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, as missionaries, more or less, to try to, number one, to study what the effects of the radiation and fallout are, and to try to cure the problem. And it is very it is explained very cynically to us in the exposition dump by the very mad Dr. William Arnold, who just hates being there. He absolutely despises the fact that he has to expend any of his education on these, these primitives who don't appreciate him and treat him with suspicion. And it's basically explained that their whole thing is like, oh, the radiation isn't so high here. It's not anything that's damaging. The real problems in these places are malaria and it turns out that the tribal chief died of the Black Plague, and they just were
plague.
Yeah, it wasn't that they couldn't do it. It wasn't that their medicine didn't work. Right, and they were eczema. They were too late to help him. But this is the thing.
What's the other exposition is the sex interest in that same scene about these.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's also this is the thing. Is and of course
you gotta get a lot in these first 20 minutes.
There's a lot of characters in this movie, and most of them are totally boring.
What's the Australian woman? She's like
Mrs. May Kilgore.
Now is she a MacGuffin? You would call that a MacGuffin? There's no reason for her at all in the picture. It just makes the thing roll along.
No, a MacGuffin is way more important than what she does. But here's the interesting thing: is that it is very interesting of how this movie starts and how it sort of directs the perspective of the audience. Because, and again, it very much speaks to the cultural and ideological disposition that you see in a lot of American movies, especially at this time where, it's the post-war era, American production is still on the rise, America's imperial presence, not just in the South Seas, not just in the Philippine Islands, but also throughout Central and South America, in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, is so massive and, more or less totally coercive and oppressive. And,
even the native says, I learned my English from the missionaries.
Yeah, that's another thing. That's another thing that they just sort of throw in that the Americans weren't the first white people to have come here. They were preceded by the Dutch, and as soon as there's a Dutch priest who's on the island who raised one of the native girls who is half white and half native.
Oh right.
And as soon as you hear the throwaway line about the Dutch there, I'm just thinking, oh boy, the Dutch, what could have possibly been happening on this island? So again, but that's the thing, is that you all that is presented is this scenario. There are the indigenous people who are conducting this savage execution, which is clearly just a cynical power play that is tied entirely to superstition. And then our gaze to this event is explicitly tied to this white woman who is peering through the bushes at the savages and becomes so terrified that she rushes back to the outpost, where she is immediately tended to by Dr. Arnold and Professor Clark. And the horrifying thing being is that as they're giving her the scotch, which is apparently the best medicine after
something,
which is apparently the best medicine for the post-traumatic stress of just seeing someone just seeing a live execution.
Right.
They
take a pull.
She literally says it would be better off if they just nuked the whole island.
I'll have nightmares the rest of me natural life. The heathens, they ought to drop a blooming hydrogen bomb in them all and blow them to pieces.
Please try to control yourself.
And it's just but this is the thing, is that so you see in this movie not only a total flattening of any historical context, not only a total sort of hand waving away of any concern that the white people, because despite the fact that clearly the American military did not account for the potential of there being some sort of weather turn that was going to blow all this fallout and radiation to the island and potentially cause all this devastation, despite the fact that they couldn't predict it, the fact that the scientists then get there and discover, the radiation's not high enough that it's causing any disease, that in and of itself is enough to just hand wave away the fact that you literally almost genocided by accident an entire community of people. And not only that, it's put in as a throwaway gag that one of the characters just refers to the idea of maybe we should just genocide all these people, maybe we should just nuke them and not give a crap. And what makes it even more stunning is that and it gets into again the extent to which like we can, again, on one level we can view this movie through a totally critical lens where it's like, okay, these are obviously like very overt manifestations of American racism and these myths of American exceptionalism, that we are always the good guys, we are always the
even when we make a mistake.
Even when we make a mistake, we are the only ones who are capable of correcting it. But there is this other aspect to the film where it's so bizarre because there are just little elements of it throughout that seem to directly contradict and subvert that certainty. Because at one point in the movie, there's a I forget who is what the name is. There's one guy who's like, he was a friend of Chemo, the tribal prince who was executed, and he comes with his wife to Professor Clark and Dr. Arnold in order to have, because apparently she has scars that have lacerated her face, and so he's just getting a standard checkup for her.
Right, she had eczema and apparently radiation reacted with the
exactly. This is the thing, is that like they literally refer to radiation burns.
Right.
So on the one hand, we are being told that the bomb was we actually deliberately conducted the test in precisely such a way that there wouldn't be any like direct effects on any indigenous people. It was just a freak climatological accident that pushed the fallout that way. But then in the same movie, and very soon after, it's revealed, no, apparently this bomb went off close enough so that the heat blast could produce burns.
Well, the radiation, it doesn't make any sense.
Right, it doesn't make any sort of fucking sense.
Either radiation's low or the radiation's high. Either one, right? And the burns, the blast don't come from radiation; they come from heat.
Right.
So that means
it was really frickin' close. They came really close to just killing all these people.
It's some non-scientific thing where the eczema interacted with whatever level of radiation they have. It somehow, but they talk about the fallout and stuff like that. Well, then that same fallout, it comes up again in The Incredible Shrinking Man.
Yeah.
When he's on his boat, he gets covered, and they try to figure out why is he shrinking, and it has to do with the fallout, that they didn't put a blob of...
And that's the only time you ever see the threat of nuclear weapons or energy ever taken seriously in American movies, is when they affect Americans.
Right. Otherwise, that's really important, right?
Right. So now you have the setup here. You have the setup of this...
Oh, no, you didn't talk about the sexual interest, because remember he talks about he's interested in...
we'll get into that.
All right,
I just want to establish the stakes here.
Well,
it's like,
there's a lot of exposition in those first two
there's
scenes.
a lot of exposition, so we had to get it all out.
Right.
There you have this basic dramatic opposition between, on the one hand, primitivism and superstition versus civilization, modernity, and the enlightening influence of more or less white people. And, so there you have this opposition, and, you have these two threats. One is the threat of, the superstition itself, which can manifest either... which, the primitives believe is like literal animism and magic, that there's literal ways that you can influence like the world through spells and incantations and potions or whatever. And then there's the real way they actually do it, which is like shit like making poison darts and whatever. And But then on the opposite end, you have the threat of modernity in the form of nuclear weapons and atomic energy. So as far as that duality, the danger of primitivism is always demonstrative and obvious, and the danger of modernity can always be hand waved away. But then what ends up happening is that the plot of the film goes in a very strange direction, where on the one hand you have these two scenes. One is of Chemo, during his execution, vowing that he will return from the grave and wreak his vengeance upon, what's the name of the goddamn evil guy? Tano, the witch doctor. He's going to come back and he's going to wreak revenge. This very classic sort of superstitious stuff. And then with the scientists, you have the acknowledgement that, there's radiation here. The island has been at least slightly irradiated. There's nuclear fallout that has fallen, and it's obviously, it's everywhere. But so what ends up happening is Chemo is buried, and then over his burial site, there begins to grow this strange amorphous root that, as it grows even further and further out of the ground, clearly not only has a face and a strange pulsating orifice which seems to suggest that it's breathing and has a heartbeat, but also a dagger in its chest, just like Chemo died with. So on the one hand, it seems like, oh, this is obviously Chemo's, dying curse coming to fruition. This is exactly, it turns out the magic has some basis in reality. But then once Professor Clark and Dr. Arnold get there with their handy Geiger counter, turns out the soil here is just awash in radiation. So it becomes this weird duality. Yeah, it becomes this weird duality that the film never really resolves it. It never even really comments upon it, that there are apparently two unique sources of this monster emerging from the earth.
The superstition or tribalism, right?
Right.
And the radiation.
Right, or the modernity. So, which is it? And the answer seems to be...
Both.
Both? Yeah, it's like... and that's the thing about the movie, is that there's lots of ways in which this is, in fact, just a garbage movie. Not the least of which being the terrible acting, the dialogue, the romantic subplot, which we'll get into, because that's a whole other can of worms that we really need to break down to its bare bones. But this is precisely the reason that actually... I think...
but I don't see those things being contradictory, right, or bad, because no one says that the radiation is making this monster. It's just hinted that it happens to be high in radiation at the roots. I don't see the connection other than the fact that maybe they think as white people, the white scientists, the modernity,
so you
that's
think it's
why it's due.
So you think it's just a question of subjective. It's like the scientists say... Well,
no, it's not the superstition, it's the radiation that's done this.
Whereas the guy who is actually Chemo's friend, who, again, and that's the fascinating thing.
More than one time.
Yeah, Chemo's...
whatever they're called.
Yeah, the Chemo's friend, the guy who literally is still staying allied with the doctors and the professors, because he's like, oh, no, I understand that you're just trying to help us, and, Chemo liked you, therefore I trust you. But even he is like, no, you don't understand. This is something that goes back generations of our society. This is something we understand better than you do. So I guess that's one way of looking at it, that this is just an arbitrary phenomenon, and that that what the film represents by simply not rendering a verdict one way or the other.
One more example where scientists assume that they're right.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be the fact that it's superstition versus scientists. It could be any kind of thing where scientists do... How many monster movies have you seen where scientists do the wrong thing, even though it has nothing to do with superstition? They just do the wrong thing and then... Right?
Well, I mean, I think there is a difference, I think, between something like Tarantula, where...
Oh, no, I didn't mean that way.
Or even Forbidden Planet, where there is a very explicit connection that is drawn between... Because that gets into the theme of scientists playing God. Like, there's this experiment that is being conducted that is very direct, and that is portrayed by the film as basically being anathema to any sort of sense of order, and which just brings these primordial evils out of the ground. With From Hell It Came, it's very interesting because it's actually a far more similar scenario to something that you might see in a Japanese giant monster movie like Godzilla or Rodan, where the point is entirely, yes, no one deliberately created this monster, but the trail of breadcrumbs, leads you right to it. Like, this thing hasn't been created because there was just some aberration of, one mad scientist's mind. It was literally just because, and obviously, like in Godzilla, the verdict comes in, that, the doctor says, yeah, this creature was created is a mutated product of American atomic bomb tests. Whereas in From Hell It Came, I think that's the point.
The doctor thinks that there's something...
Yeah, and we only see their perspective.
Right.
We only see their perspective, which is that, well, the radiation could be the thing that's causing this to happen, but we can't possibly know. It's so there's no verdict rendered, but it does create this very interesting subversive quality to the film that is in fact only enhanced by the fact that, number one, the acting is pretty uniformly terrible, but especially Professor Clark and Dr. Arnold. These characters are just such dullards. They are so...
Yeah, they are.
They are just awful, awful people. And, you know, Professor Clark is at least somewhat better because he, like, actually seems to care about the plight of the natives. He really does want to stick around and, like, try to bring them into civilization. He's got a whole white man's burden complex going on. At the same time, there are numerous points in this movie where Clark will just render a theory on what has happened, and it will just be demonstrably proven that, like, he is just abjectly wrong. And the funniest one of it comes when, okay, so they find the tree monster that's growing, the imminent tree monster that's growing out of the ground. The natives call it Tabanga. Yeah, right. The natives call it Tabanga. Although it's interesting, in the trailer for the movie they call it Baranga. It's like and in the Allied Artists Showmanship campaign book, which is basically the publicity book that they printed, it's called Taranga. And even in the movie itself, there's one bit player in the movie who at one point refers to the monster not as Tabanga, but as Tabango in one scene, but then the rest of the movie he gets it exactly right.
Kano, why don't you destroy the Tabango with medicine? Tabanga come! Tabanga come!
So you know that, like, and this was a thing that I joked with you about, is like, okay, do you think that he got the name of the line wrong, but they could only do it in one take, so they just moved on and didn't think about it? Or do you think they actually did do multiple takes, one of where he got it right most of the time, but they just decided, but his performance was just so real in this one, we have to do right.
What happened? Like, it's just right. It's just a slip of the...
Yeah, so again, like, it's like an old Mystery Science Theater 3000 joke. It's like, folks, they just didn't care. But anyway, okay, so Tabanga is growing out of the ground, and the scientists decide, all right, we're gonna dig it. Or despite the advice of, again, one of the few natives who actually trust them to the end of the world, and just like, he's telling them, no, do not just take it with you. You should just throw it in the quicksand. Right. Just throw it in the quicksand, because that's how we get rid of everything.
That's how the last one got rid of it.
Yeah, that's how we got rid of the last one. We're gonna, but they say, no, we're gonna take it back to our lab, and we're gonna study this thing. And so,
what can go wrong?
Yeah, what could go wrong? Okay, so enter into our narrative Dr. Terry Mason, played by Tina Carver, who is the romantic interest, although how romantic it is I guess is open to interpretation, is the romantic interest of Dr. William Arnold, played by Todd Andrews. And Tina Carver shows up in order to more or less, apparently, to study the effects of the radiation on the fauna of the island, and to conduct these experiments. And so but what becomes clear but this is a thing that has been set up earlier in the film in that exposition dump we mentioned before, is that Dr. Arnold is very smitten with Dr. Mason, and he's very upset that he literally uses the term independent woman, like, as a thing that is just standing in his way of convincing her to just bed down with him and just, like, become a housewife and mother. And he's just obsessed with Dr. Mason. So as soon as she arrives, he immediately abandons all pretense that they have a job to do. And look, this is something that's going to come up a lot.
Obviously, no one took compliance training in this movie.
No, it's like, this is something that's going to come up a lot as we go into these old movies. But this is a thing that, you know, we all have to, even if you do, like, we shouldn't be glib about it, because these are obviously reflective of, like, real things that were going on at the time. Yeah. But, like, there is a black comedy to it, and just because even like I think
even
like
without that, it's comic.
like yeah, there's lots of sexism in these old B movies. I don't think, with the exception of It Came from Beneath the Sea, I don't think I've seen as thoroughly patronizingly sexist relationship as the one in From Hell It Came, because it's just so
that's probably the worst.
just the central message being it fucking sucked to be a female professional in the 1950s, and this happens in every B movie because it happened in real life.
Well,
the moment you step into these professional settings, it becomes absolutely impossible for you to work
in them
professionally.
It doesn't. I mean, it seems like it's less of it's not in them, right?
Maybe not in them.
No, but she turns out to be the one, tells him, "No, I'm going down because you don't know what to do. Where are you gonna go down? You're gonna rescue me."
Yeah. What are you gonna do about it? You're gonna go into the ass and I'm gonna do this myself. I studied this for a living.
Right.
I'm my father's daughter. And
I can know how to kill him. You're gonna go down there. What are you gonna do? You don't know what you're doing.
So basically, the entire romantic subplot of this movie, and this is the thing. This is what passed for a romantic subplot in the 50s, which is basically just a guy who cannot take no for an answer, just bludgeoning and pestering not just a woman, not just someone he's trying to date, but literally a colleague, literally someone who is specifically there just to do a job.
Right.
And there's this absolutely awful, there's this pretty hilarious part where he's like, one of the lines he uses to try to convince her, like, to basically just stop fooling around and marry him is just like, "Oh, look at all these beautiful exotic flowers I can get you. And it doesn't cost a thing."
Here you are, Terry. Nature's own flower shop. Orchids, hibiscus, you name them, we have them.
Thanks, Bill. It's very lovely.
Almost as lovely as you are. I'm going to fill your hut every morning with jungle flowers. That's one of the advantages of living in this primitive area. You can give your girl a fortune in flowers. And it doesn't cost a cent.
It's like exactly what a woman wants to hear. There's just an absolutely grotesque kiss where Tina Carver, the performance that she's supposed to be giving, because this is a movie written by men in the 50s, and because it is absolutely as sexist as you think, her whole thing is that it's not that I'm not attracted to you, which is why I keep saying no, don't touch me. The reason I do that is because, but I'm a professional and I can't allow my emotions to overrun me.
Right.
And so it becomes this thing about I need to be the man who passionately... So Tina Carver, after she gets kissed by Todd Andrews, which is, again, another of these 50s kisses where, to men in the 50s, the most romantic thing you could do is literally just grab a woman's shoulders in a vice-like grip and pull their face in tears. She turns away from him, and, the rationalization, what Tina Carver is supposed to be performing is that, I can't give in to my emotions, but it just totally reads as, this is an assault that's going on. I need to think of something to say quick because this is really, really bad.
No, you're right. I mean, at least that feels that way in today's times. That it does seem like that. You almost cringe in some of those scenes. You're right. Absolutely right.
Anyway, but it is, Dr. Terry Mason, there's a lot of things to respect about her. She's a very professional woman. She's certainly not as annoying or genocidal as Mrs. May Kilgore, but she is the one who comes up with the brilliant decision after they have brought Tabanga back to their lab to basically just juice it up with an experimental serum to bring it back to life after its pulse stops. Again, what could go wrong is that she hypothesizes it'll take about 8 hours. It does not take 8 hours. Tabanga is up and raring about. We don't see Tabanga get up and ruin the lab, and it's never really explained how Tabanga gets up and ruins the lab, and just no one hears anything. No one figures out that that's what's going on. They just stumble into the lab after it's been destroyed, and they're like, "Oh my God, what happened here?"
And not only did the Tabanga destroy the lab, he destroyed all the communication.
Yeah, he knows what he's doing. He's a smart monster.
Right.
And so this is another thing. So it gets into I'm you, the listener, even if you haven't seen the movie. Look, I'm just presenting you with a very simple choice. This is you either need to assume that the people who made this movie were either under such incredible constraints or were such tremendous morons that they just accidentally wrote a movie in which an atomic tree monster grows out of the ground and then dies and then is brought back to life by a trio of well-meaning white scientists and proceeds to go on a killing spree of a bunch of natives. Or, we can give into the possibility that even if it wasn't their intent, the intent doesn't matter. That, the narrative of this movie is explicitly about these white man's burden colony.
I think you're being too harsh, because their idea was to study it because it's a new form of life, right? That's her.
Well, right, they have, but that's the thing, is but their job also coming to the island was to help potentially cure the radiation sickness. This is the thing, this is the story of white man's burden. This is the story of white civilization. White people are always, in their estimation, they are always the best at solving other people's problems, especially when it's they themselves who have caused the problems. And so you get this situation where it's like, okay, you have this duality between the primitive witch doctor Tano, who just wants to promote superstition and is totally cynically motivated in preserving his power, which because we only perceive the movie really through this Americanized gaze, which is communicated through Kilgore, is communicated through that first sequence of shots where we see the execution, and then we see her gazing, and then we see her run back to the safety of white civilization. You have that, which suggests to you that we are supposed to view this through the lens of these people who are just convinced that, we're only ever doing what is in others' best interests. We are never truly responsible for bad things. But then just the evidence keeps mounting so precipitously that it becomes this thing of is there any way to watch this movie except as a kind of black comedy about just these well-meaning white people who are just all uniformly ignorant, and just anything that these indigenous people say about what the actual threat is.
Right.
And so you end up with this situation as maybe Tano had a point. Maybe they should just kill all the white people.
Well, even the professor says, no, tell you what, let's not bring it back. The doctor.
Yeah, he's like, why don't we not do that?
Why don't we just take it and do what they say? Let it die, get rid of it.
Yeah, and that's the other weird thing about the movie, is that for all of Dr. Arnold's problems, like the fact that he's a sexual predator, for all of his problems, and despite the fact that he is racist, he does just not give one iota of a care about the indigenous people of the island. He just wants to get out and go home.
Right.
He nonetheless, despite that racism, more than Professor Clark and Dr. Mason, who are the more devoted professional people, he is the one who is circumspect enough to say, look, maybe there's just some things we don't understand and that we're never going to understand, so maybe rather than meddling in this crap, we should just pull up stakes and get the hell out of here before all of our heads are shrunken and put on pikes. Yeah, so it's definitely this interesting thing, and it comes to a head, and we are going to spoil the ending of the movie. Because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay, all right, what do you think is going to happen, folks? Do you think they're going to kill the monster? Oh, do you think there's going to be some twist ending where the monster actually survives and all the white people die or something? No, okay, so what happens is Tabanga goes on a rampage, kills all the people who kills his wife who betrayed him,
Right.
kills Tano the
Tongo.
witch doctor, kills the usurper chief of the island, the one who has taken control in the absence of his father, and then so bizarrely, seeming in connection to nothing, kidnaps Dr. Mason as the party of the white people are attempting to find and hunt Tabanga.
But that's so stupid because she brought him to life. If anything, he should thank her.
Well, and this is the thing, is that, like, you have to go, and again, it goes back to this weird duality of the
But
film.
it doesn't matter.
where it's
The
like-
idea is Tamaga will kill everyone.
Right, and that's exactly what the native
Right,
friend
so
of
he'll
Chemo
kill
says.
us
Is
all
like,
and
he'll kill us all. But again, it becomes this really weird thing, because obviously Chemo did threaten a curse. He did threaten to come back from the dead, but he specifically threatened to kill just the people who wronged him.
Right.
Not literally anybody who gets in his way. And so there becomes this weird thing of, like, again, it becomes this weird, like, contradiction that is never resolved in the movie between the superstition and the scare quotes scientific explanation of, like, what is Tabanga? Is Tabanga really Chemo come back from the dead to seek righteous vengeance?
Well, it does have a knife in him.
He does have the knife in him, and he seems to coincidentally kill all the people who wronged him first.
We couldn't
But-
stop there.
But he couldn't stop there. And that's the thing, it's like the next person that he attempts
Kate
to
Mason.
bring to the quicksand, that's
Right.
that's his favorite method of killing people. Because here's the thing, folks, Tabanga is really slow. He's really, really slow. And the natives try to kill him once by literally just drawing him into a tiger pit and setting it on fire. It doesn't work,
It just
but
pisses him off.
it's proof that, like, the Tabangas are not terribly hard to get rid of. Again, they should have just listened to Chemo's friend. They should have just thrown it in the quicksand. Tabanga's favorite method of execution is literally just to carry people to either to quicksand
Or just go.
or to a cliff and just throw them down the cliff. Like, Tabanga literally can't do anything. Like, it's actually a real wonder why they don't just, like, get a machete or an axe or something and just fucking go to town on Tabanga. Like, just get some, like, 20 of the natives to just do that.
Right. What can he do? Right?
Like, what can Tabanga do? But anyway, Tabanga does kidnap Dr. Mason, who, like all women in these movies, immediately faints. Because it's just like, you know, it's either this woman who is this, you know, independent scientist who has probably, like, seen more dead bodies more irradiated corpses than Marie Curie, just to suddenly faints at the sight of what basically looks like the talking trees from The Wizard of Oz after they've been pruned. But
Right.
she faints and he's carrying her. But it's this weird thing where it's like the continuity of motivation between Chemo's curse and the motivations of the monster itself are never clarified or resolved.
I don't think the monster doesn't care. I think the monster, that's why the native said, not only will it take care of the curse, it'll take care of everybody. We already know in the beginning, the monster's indiscriminate.
Right. So maybe this is another example of the sort of thing where it's like, well, that's the danger of
Which
the
is
native
like-
superstition, is that it starts as justice, but because it's pure savagery, because there's no court or anything.
Well, what's an interesting parallel is the fact that just like atomic radiation, what can go wrong blew over this island. Similarly speaking, the voodoo superstition of this tree not only kills the people that
are in the wrong,
they're
it's
cursed,
just a threat to everybody.
it's a threat to everybody.
So again, so there's again this duality.
There's some kind of
There's this
power.
weird, there's
But
this weird.
I'm sure that this was not the intention of the writers.
Well,
Maybe
probably
it was.
not. Maybe. Like, then again, like, if
Are they
anyone...
still alive? No.
No, probably not. But if anyone who is listening is a family member of the Milner brothers, if they want to call us and say, like, hey, or shoot us an email, like, hey, we would like to know, what were they thinking?
Was Wikipedia, does it have an outline of the...
Wikipedia, the interesting thing is, like, most of the things that people find interesting about this movie, because, you know, From Hell It Came does not have a high... Even among B-movie fanatics, it is not a very highly prized movie, which I think is unfortunate for a lot of the reasons that we've unpackaged here, just because of how just absurd it gets in terms of just the narrative of it and how explicit it is. But most of what, you know, people gravitate, especially in the B-movie sort of cult fandom, is specifically the monster itself. And the reason is because the monster was designed by a guy named Paul Blaisdell. Now, Paul Blaisdell was basically a guy who, for a very brief time in the 50s, made his bread and butter by doing very quick, very cheap special effects for companies like American International Pictures and Allied Pictures for their monster movies. He mostly worked in designing and constructing monster outfits. He did the monster effects for, and sometimes he was even in the suits themselves. He did the monster effects for The Beast with a Million Eyes, The Day the World Ended, It Conquered the World, The She Creature, Not of This Earth, How to Make a Monster, which is sort of a, we discussed this last night off air, that like that's definitely a movie that we should cover in another day. And It, the Terror from Beyond Space, another of your...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he designed the monster for that. Here's the thing about this movie. Paul Blaisdell did design Tabanga, but he didn't construct the suit as he normally did. What happened was he prepared a number of... This is according to Vincent DeFate, who is a science fiction and fantasy artist who did a obituary on Paul Blaisdell for the website Tor.com, and I'll leave a link to it in the show description because it's a fascinating story in and of itself. But he, according to DeFate, for the Milners, Blaisdell prepared a number of color sketches of Tabanga, but final construction of the tree monster costume was done at the Don Post Studios in Hollywood without Blaisdell's knowledge or participation. And what DeFate gets into is not only was the costume not done with Blaisdell's knowledge or participation, he received no payment and no credit. So this is like, you know, that may be like a tangent for another day, just like in term, maybe we can even talk about it if we do How to Make a Monster or The Ghost of Drag Strip Alley, but like just the, you know, these very cheap movies to make were often, you know, the way these like filmmakers hung together was often very much on the basis of a sense of like camaraderie and like a sort of unspoken understanding that, you know, like whatever work you did, however on the cheap it was, that you were going to be able to do it consistently.
Is he credited in the movie?
No, he's not credited at all in the movie. Again, he wasn't credited. He wasn't paid. They didn't even tell him that they were using his design. But I will also include links to the concept art. I do actually have some concept art of the which is included in DeFate's piece, and it's very explicit that they directly ripped off his work and just didn't tell him, credit him, or pay him. As far as the fate of Tabanga itself, it goes back to, again, like, just in case, like, you have any, like, lingering doubts that there's anything subversive about this movie, whether it's intentional or unintentional, the ending of the movie, when Tabanga is taking Dr. Mason to the quicksand. Now, who knows why he's taking it to the quicksand? Maybe it's like the Hammer Mummy, where it's like he's just trying to bring a bride back or whatever, or he's just trying to kill her, or he's just going to throw her in or whatever.
He hasn't killed everybody yet.
So what happens is, because the dagger is still in Tabanga or Chemo's heart, what they have to do is drive the dagger all the way through. And so what they do is, like, rather than just running up to the creature with a hammer and just hitting it really hard in the chest, they literally they start shooting while he has Dr. Mason in the clutches of his arms over his chest. They are firing at a target, a very tiny...
turned away from them.
Yeah, turned away from them, a very tiny target on it. So the physics of this are completely not understandable. So they're just firing at this creature's back and licking off shots. And despite the fact that, like, the creature is more or less invulnerable because it's, like, it's made of tree bark. And so, therefore, the bullets aren't having much effect. Eventually, apparently, it just gets annoyed by getting shot a bunch of times. Drops Dr. Mason, turns around, and then in his final righteous act, because they have to do something to clarify that Dr. Arnold is a true hero, despite the fact that he has done absolutely nothing at all heroic throughout this entire film.
Couldn't shoot a gun to save his life.
Probably
the fact that the expert
takes the gun.
No, they both have guns.
Yeah, they both have guns, but he takes the final shot and it hits the dagger right square on the handle, goes into the heart of the monster. Tobanga falls into the quicksand. All of the natives come out of the woodwork, including the ones that were like originally on Tano's side, and they're like, "Oh, we trust you, white people. Now we're gonna, please stay with us because you've killed the monster." And of course, Dr. Arnold embraces Dr. Mason, and it's just like, because the fastest way to a woman's heart is saving her life. Right. That's the only thing that ever resolves the. But again, so think about it this way. The movie opens with an unjust ruler in the form of Tano and Chief Maranka driving a dagger into the heart of the rightful prince of this indigenous people.
Right.
The movie ends with the knife being driven even further into the heart of this monstrous-fied version of this same character.
Right. And
concludes with Professor Clark more or less being elected the new enlightened chief of the island. And so I'm just, that's all I'm saying, is that, and I think we can put it to bed there because we still got the Disembodied to get to. And I don't think Disembodied will take as much to talk about because there are interesting things about it. And in fact, it's probably a better movie.
Sure, because the concept is voodooism.
Right. Technically, it's also just better made. But
it's better made, yeah.
But yeah, I think we can put a nail in the coffin from Helen Camp. Dad, what would you say? What's your rating of this movie? Like as far as you don't need to put a number to it. If the highest is
what fascinates me, and I told you about this before, I always think about the people that are behind the scenes that put these things together. What work it takes. And I always wonder what goes, at the question I just asked you, did they have that in mind when they wrote that scene? Was it that, let's put this in because this means this,
that's the thing. It doesn't necessarily need to. You don't need. But here's the thing: you don't need to know that it meant the specific metaphor tying
that'd be great
Tano to Professor Clark. It would be great if they did. But here's the thing: they wrote a script. Bernstein, the guy who wrote it, Richard Bernstein, wrote a script that begins with a dagger being driven into the heart of one character, and ended the script with a dagger being driven into the heart of another character. Regardless of whether the metaphor was intentional, there was clearly a vision behind this. However meager it might have been, however modest, there was a legitimate attempt being made here.
Right.
To try to create a well-crafted story. And despite the fact that again, the characters are thoroughly unempathetic, they're played terribly. A lot of the film is just there are fight sequences in this movie and they're just terribly done. But yeah, I think you're right. There's something going on under the hood of this movie.
Right, it'd be great to talk to the writer and see what he was thinking.
Yeah, I don't know if he's alive, but hey, if you're the son of or inheritor of the estate of Richard Bernstein or of Jack and Dan Milner, give us a call or shoot us an email. We want to talk about From Hell It Came. We want to talk about your father or grandfather's unrecognized independent vision.
Right.
We want to talk about
it. Right.
We want to hear your side of the story. All right, everyone. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to descend into our coffins for a bit to re-energize and drink virgin blood. When we come back, we're going to be dipping into the second end of this double bill, the Disembodied.
You killed Super, my husband.
Get out of here!
You bad. You killed my husband. I hate you. You will die.
We are back, folks. We just got finished doing a deep dive into From Hell It Came. And while From Hell It Came is still obviously a fairly obscure example of the B movie, we're now going to be getting into the second film that was distributed along with From Hell It Came by Allied artists, which is actually even more obscure. To the extent that I couldn't even find a trailer for it online. There's obviously a lot less information about this movie than From Hell It Came, and a lot of it seems to be just a very deliberate, not even deliberate, but like a function of the fact that, you know, if you look into the publicity materials, and you in fact...
Yeah, so when they were double billed, which was the highlight one? Do you know?
The first one was definitely From Hell It Came, and that was definitely the one that Allied artists like used to drive the publicity for the film. And you see that, especially like with there is a great resource that I found for anybody who is interested. It's the Allied Artists Showmanship Campaign book, which is basically materials that they distributed to local theaters that were going to be carrying the film in order to... These campaign books basically, they provide templates for advertising materials, like for newspaper advertisements that could be that different theaters, like literally you'll see. And the way I found this resource was there's a blog called Zombo's Closet, where a collector of these materials managed to get a hold of a copy of the Allied Artists Showmanship Campaign book for From Hell It Came and the Disembodied, and put up some fairly low-resolution scans of the pamphlet. And it really is a great window into just, you know, despite the fact that these movies were obviously produced very quickly and cheaply, a lot of thought, and perhaps a lot more thought, went into the advertisement and the build-up of these movies in order to, you know, again, to get butts in seats. Where, you know, so here's an example of, like, what would be included in this, like, as basically advice to local theaters of how they can really drum up the ballyhoo and really get kids to, like, want to come out and see these movies. It literally, in a section of the pamphlet entitled Exploitation, one of the sections is Transform Tree Trunk into Movie Monster. Your local park department or a lumber company can aid you in making a movie monster like Taranga. Again, that's not the name of the monster in the movie. It's Tabanga, but in From Hell It Came. Try and obtain the trunk of a tree about 7 feet high. If it has a few branches on it, all the better. If it has too many, prune the tree to resemble the protrusions shown on the left, and it shows a little picture of Tabanga. Then have your sign artist do the rest. Have him either paint or chisel out the eyes, mouth, etc., so when the job is done, you will have a fairly good replica. Spot Taranga in front of your theater and light up to make it as eerie as possible. And there's all sorts of stuff like this. They even, like, advise you on, like, maybe, like, even getting local theater groups or performers together to be, like, the island dancers, like, maybe, like, in the lobby of your theater or outside it on, like, opening day. But the interesting thing is that, like, there is much more material that is provided in terms of publicity for From Hell It Came, because of the exploitable content that it has, principally Tabanga the monster, which is obviously a huge selling point at this point, even in this late period of these sort of B movies and monster pictures, but fairly little in the way of actually selling the second bill. And this is interesting because while From Hell It Came was again produced by the Milner Brothers startup company and the rights sold to Allied artists for distribution, the Disembodied was actually both produced and distributed by Allied artists. And so there becomes this interesting scenario where we have much more historical material on the film that Allied artists didn't even produce than we do of the film that they did produce, and which was the second bill of this double feature. The Disembodied was directed by Walter Grauman. He, unlike the Milner Brothers, he was a career director. He mostly worked in TV. He directed 21 episodes of Matinee Theater, 21 episodes of The Untouchables, as well as the episode of The Twilight Zone Miniature, which is my opinion, one of the best Twilight Zone episodes. It's about the guy who goes to a museum and becomes obsessed with the replica doll houses in them. You remember that one? It's about the guy who's like, he's just obsessed with the doll houses, and he like sees the dolls in the houses coming to life, and eventually, well, I won't give away that one. The ending of that, the twist of there is much better.
Well, I like the one where the guy is, I think, one of the better Twilight Zones.
He did one episode of it.
Right. There's one even better than that, and it was the second series of Twilight Zone done in color.
Oh, like the revival, the 80s one.
Yes, and it was about a Nazi in South America.
Oh, I think that is no, that's a remake of a classic episode. Yeah, there's a white supremacist, and there's like a shadowy figure who's advising him on all these ways that he can win over people.
No, that's not it. No, it's different. He's actually fearful of being sought by the...
Oh, so he's like an ex-Nazi,
yes.
And he's being chased by
he's in South America.
And Mossad is after him.
And he's chased so much that he's so tired that he finds his solace in an art museum. And he sees this guy on a boat, and he imagines that he's in the boat just on the tranquil water rowing. So on the last scene, when they finally catch up with him, he kills somebody, I think, who is onto him. That knows he's a Jew friend, a Jew that's living in the same barrio, whatever you want to call it. It was horrible, like really a rundown place. Right. Recognizes him, finds it, and then he runs when the authorities are after him. He goes into the museum and he prays to God, please take
And he escapes into the painting.
But he doesn't, because they switched the paintings.
Oh, that's a good twist.
It's a crucifixion on fire. And
that's what you get, you Nazi scum.
And they're where did he go? The guys are going in, and all of a sudden the guys say, let's forget about it. We lost him. He's not in here. And all of a sudden the guy just turns and he hears this faint scream. And he just looks around. He doesn't hear it. Just leaves. And then the camera zooms in on the painting. It's the guy. It's actually awesome.
Anyway.
Anyway, go ahead.
The Disembodied, directed by Walter Grauman, mostly a TV director, written by Jack Townley, who was he's a screenwriter who had been working since the 20s. He had a very robust career. Most of the movies that he wrote were sort of dramas and crime films. This movie, The Disembodied, was his third to last screen credit. Either before he retired or he died. But yeah, so this is a much more, even these are relative standards, but you can immediately tell as soon as the movie starts that this is, as far as the relative standards of B movies, this is Allied Artists' A picture. It has much better production value than From Hell It Came. It's much better written. It's much better acted.
Yes.
There's no monster in it, which is probably the reason why it wasn't particularly hyped up as much as From Hell It Came, because From Hell It Came had the convenience of that exploitable element of the monster, whereas The Disembodied is really much more of a straightforward supernatural horror movie.
No, it's a mix of supernatural horror and a typical melodrama of a woman. Mm-hmm. A two-faced woman.
It's much more character-driven.
Right. Yeah.
And it's very much more emphasis placed on atmospherics rather than discrete violence. Or there's definitely a lot of sexual tension in the movie, which is definitely part of the draw of this film. But what I want to get into, just starting off, in terms of this difference, basically the only thing that is similar between From Hell It Came and The Disembodied is that it takes place in this vague tropical jungle setting, whereas From Hell It Came took place in the South Seas, and The Disembodied takes place somewhere in the Caribbean. There's obviously lots of black people. They you know, there's lots of like mestizos, you know, characters who are supposed to be of like perhaps of mixed race, and there seems to be like a lot of tension in the movie regarding that fact that there's this strange liminal space between, again, modern society and these, you know, scare quotes, primitive and superstitious belief structures that are always threatening to just consume, you know, the auspices of modernity, and basically like they're associated with the jungle themselves. Like, again, just like with From Hell It Came, we don't really get any perspective on like there being a society to these people of what their lives are. Basically, they're just associated like literally with the jungle. This is like some primordial savage energy. And what makes it interesting is that, you know, this movie, which is produced by people who are much more standard careerists in terms of the history of Hollywood, even in terms of just being low budget filmmakers. Since it was released in 1957, The Disembodied is actually kind of like it's kind of out of date for the time. Like, it feels much less like the sort of ballyhoo that you would get in the late 50s when, like, the obsession was with, like, you know, atomic energy and mutation and the threats of, you know, like, playing in God's domain. And instead, it's much more like the sort of thing that, like, RKO would have made. It's almost like a Val Lewton horror movie where it's, like, again, like you say, it's much more this character-driven...
Or like the Four Skulls of Jonathan Drake.
Yeah, it's a much more... so that's the interesting thing about the movie. And basically, the plot of The Disembodied... what we open with The Disembodied is of a voodoo doll, which is being used by the character named Tonda Metz, played by Allison Hayes, who was a fairly successful character actress during this period, especially in B movies, especially movies like The Disembodied, where she was kind of like a B movie sex symbol. Where she plays Tonda Metz, who is this woman who it's really not clear like what her origin is. Well, it's not what her background is. She's this very young woman who is married to a psychologist who is living in this Caribbean jungle named Dr. Carl Metz, played by John Wengroff. And so he's a much older man, she's a much younger woman, and the way we're introduced to her is that she's strangling a voodoo doll, and then we see the Dr. Metz, like, literally, you know, starting to suffocate. So we're already at a point where, as in From Hell It Came, there's sort of this, like... there's this unresolved tension between, all right, is this a function of, like, modernity and science or superstition? Here, it's right at the surface level. Some supernatural shenanigans are going on. Here is your villainess. There's no two bones about it. It's a thriller in the sense that this isn't a mystery to find out who the bad guy is. You are shown this is the bad guy, and the tension comes from the fact of, like, how far is she going to get in pursuing her just totally narcissistic and evil plans before someone can put a stop to her. In the midst of this scenario, we are introduced to Tom Maxwell, played by Paul Burke, and his friend Norman Adams, played by Joel Marston. And these guys, interestingly enough, and again, this aspect of it that seems to harken back to older Hollywood and older forms of pulp filmmaking, are filmmakers. Now, they're dressed as, like, jungle explorers, but what happens is that the reason they come to this house in the middle of nowhere is because one of their crew members has been attacked and savaged by a lion. And so they come to the doctor's house, and the doctor just doesn't want them to be there at all. But
lion or tiger? Do you know what it was?
It's a lion.
Okay.
So what a lion is doing, again, where this is taking place is like, all right, so are we in Africa or is it the Caribbean?
Well,
Where
voodoo has to be. Well, no, you're right. Voodoo can be.
Voodoo
right.
is voodoo,
Caribbean,
and again, like
right?
so again, like obviously, like a lot of this is just like American centralism and racism, where it's like voodoo is basically just any sort of practice that ties into Aboriginal, particularly Black superstition and African rites. So like obviously the ethnographic accuracy isn't particularly important to the filmmakers, but what you do get in this characterization of Tanda Metz is, number one, either through lighting or through makeup, she is depicted as fairly dark complexioned. So you're not quite sure if she's supposed to be like a multiracial person, but there's definitely an underlying implication that, like, even if she is white, she is thoroughly subsumed in, to put too fine a point on it, black magic. That she is like total, and not only that, like she's wearing like some sort of
like a sarong or
a Chinese, like scare quotes Oriental style outfit, which suggests that she's kind of a woman of the world, at least as a function of who she's
her
married.
Husband's rich.
Right, her husband is a wealthy psychologist who has just basically isolated himself from the world.
Like Ginger Baker.
Right, and so so while he is still very much this old, he's very much this old, like he's kind of this classical archetype, this old white guy who's just living alone in the jungle, who has just escaped into this primitive world to isolate himself from humanity because he's kind of misanthropic, whereas his younger wife is now this quasi-miscegenated figure who the association is then explicitly drawn between how Orientalized and how Africanized she has become, and the fact that she is now driven totally by these narcissistic desires. First and foremost, which is the plot of the movie, is that she's attempting to kill her husband, or to get someone else to kill her husband for her.
I know, but before you go on to that, it's just very bizarre that, first of all, you have to ask yourself the question, how did she get into that predicament? I mean,
how'd she marry this guy?
Right.
Because we find out plenty about him. We find out plenty about Maxwell and his filmmaker buddy. Yeah, like we don't know anything about her.
Even from his point of view, the husband's point of view, we don't get an idea of how he found her or how they met, and you just get this sense of that they're just together, and they're their other films, there's more of an exposition, right? You don't get this.
And there's no, and the thing is
that's a weak point in the picture.
And the thing is that there's no formality. There's no formality given to that this is a happy marriage. Like they clearly,
well, right.
he might like have some feelings for her, but she clearly despises him. She's the one who invites Maxwell and his injured friend inside. She's the one who is.
Right.
It's actually her voodoo. Maxwell, Dr. Metz is not able to do anything for the friend. Like he explicitly tells them, look, he's been horribly mauled by a lion. He's lost a lot of blood. He's gonna die here.
Right.
And then she performs some kind of voodoo magic, which actually interestingly involves the human sacrifice of Metz's manservant Suba, who is a
white man,
in brown face, played by Dean Fredericks. And again, there's total flattening of context. Of like, for whatever reason, Suba and his wife have bindis. Like they have like they have the Hindi dot on their head. It's like and again, there's total flattening of context. It's basically all these Oriental motifs, but he's very loyal in that kind of, again, archetypical, like, brown manservant to the white settler thing where, he always calls him Bwana, which is like this, this childish way of saying master. He ends up being somehow through the ritual that she performs, he somehow becomes basically hypnotized, and then he's brought to a sacrificial ritual where we get to see obviously the highlight of the movie, which is Allison Hayes in a very skimpy outfit performing
rather badly.
Yeah, she does her best with the material she's given. There was obviously not very complex choreography was put into this. Just swivel around a little. It's like, which, not for nothing, Allison Hayes is a very beautiful woman, and so you understand why, that she's the draw of the movie. Like, this is what this is all about.
Right.
So, but it also becomes this, this is where the similarities, we start to see them with From Hell It Came, not in terms of, the actual plot, but in terms of these sort of ideological patterns that we see arising. Where you noted in From Hell It Came, all of the actors are white people in brownface, except notably a lot of the women who play in the tribe are clearly either of
islanders or something, right?
Of mixed race. Some of them maybe are just Spanish or Greek, which was but in the late 50s still not quite white yet, but it does play on this idea that there are certain things that you can get away with showing women of color doing, even if they're just characters of color. It doesn't even matter if the actress themselves is a woman of color. There are things that you can show them doing that are titillating and obviously there just to be spectacles for the white male viewer that you can't get away with a white woman. And so just like with Kilgore looking in on the execution of Chemo in From Hell It Came, there is the connection is very much drawn between Allison Hayes performing this ritual and doing this dance, and then Tom Maxwell and his friend Norman coming into the forest and, peering through the grass and bearing witness to this thing. And apparently they just completely missed that there's a guy just tied to a slab somewhere and just about to be killed.
I was going to say, they didn't see that happening?
But that's the other thing. Apparently they don't even make the connection that the woman in the ritual is Tonda. It doesn't seem like they even make the connection. Maybe it's just... But anyway, so there's this whole idea of... There's this whole tension in the movie that and this is very much connected to genre. And it kind of goes back to what you mentioned before about the moral sort of gray zone that a lot of B movies have, not just in terms of their technical accomplishment, but in terms of these ideas of whether or not they're promoting something that is lascivious. Mm-hmm. And or transgressive.
No, I think they're just deliberately using that as the ploy to have people come watch the movie.
Right.
You always have to have
you have to have your exploitable element.
Right.
But apparently, again, as we said with the promotional material, apparently Allison Hayes is not as good of. Apparently Allison Hayes in a thong and a bamboo bikini is not as big of a selling point as a rubber tree monster. So what we get is this very weird sense of obviously the whole point of this movie is to ogle Allison Hayes, is to show the sort of ways in which she uses her feminine mystique and her quasi-orientalized, black magic to draw men to her whim. And where this is paired, despite the fact that this is the thing that is portrayed as the bad thing, she's the villain of the film, this is obviously what the entire point of the spectacle is about. This is what we as the spectator, especially the white male spectator, are being played upon to see. So it becomes this weird, it's kind of this classic aspect of genre theory, where you approach it with saying, there's an ideological safety valve that is being turned, where it's so if you go to see a gangster movie, look, obviously most gangster movies end with the gangsters getting their comeuppance. They go to jail, or they get shot, or they get blown up.
Right.
Just as we keep saying is the message, crime does not pay.
Right.
Crime needs to pay in some fashion. There needs to be some punishment. But let's be real. The reason we go to see these gangster movies and noir movies is not so that we can see the gangster be punished. The reason we go to see these gangster movies is so we can see gangsters be bad people. So we can engage in this vicarious thrill.
Sure.
So what's interesting about the Disembodied is that it provides this very focused understanding or example of like how this applies in a sexual dimension, where clearly the only reason anybody is going to see the Disembodied is to see Allison Hayes be a mischievous little hussy and to parade around in these sexy outfits and to just swivel her hips around and basically be
when she was same thing in the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. She's the woman somehow magnificently they garbed her. She grew 50 feet overnight, but she's all fully dressed. Right.
But the ideological safety valve that gets turned then is that she is like some devil woman. Right. It's not you as the male spectator who has this perverse objectifying desire to see women this way. It's that she's doing something to you. She knows you're looking and she's trying to cast a spell on you. And so it's kind of a formulaic story. We all know where this is.
Like most males south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Well, most males everywhere. Especially at this time. Like, it's sort of like what, to paraphrase what Malcolm X said, anywhere south of Canada is south of the Mason-Dixon. But yeah, so we have this, I thought it was a better made movie. It was a better made movie.
The pacing was good.
And and to its credit, again, it's this interesting thing of whereas whatever subversiveness there is in From Hell It Came, where since we can't possibly know the intent of the filmmakers, we have to presume that it must be like there must be some, if there is a subtext there or a subversiveness, it's unintentional. Whereas Jack Townley's script for the Disembodied, it actually presents this ambivalence right at the surface of the drama, where the very first long interaction between Maxwell and Tonda Metz, between Burke and Allison Hayes is referring to, playing this role where she's referring to the Aboriginals in the jungle doing their rituals, and she's saying they're just, they're scared people. They just do these things because they're superstitious. And then he says, well, isn't that just like people all over the world? We believe what we believe, and we are afraid, we fear what we don't understand.
My husband has very little practice here. The natives have their own doctors.
You mean the witch doctors?
Yes. That's what the white men call them.
Do these witch doctors actually effect cures?
Who knows? The natives are a very strange people. They believe what they want to believe and distrust what they do not understand.
Well, isn't that about the same with all mankind? I mean, we believe what we like to believe.
And you distrust what you do not understand?
And it's just it's such a it's obviously this much more coming right after the movie, where again we literally had a comic relief character wish a nuclear genocide on an entire indigenous population, to then have this guy who is again characterized as who is a filmmaker, who is literally a maker of movies, saying you can't really judge these people. What they're doing is really not so different than the way any other human being would react. And so there is this element of obviously racism and definitely misogyny to the movie.
And yeah, there's a lot of bit of and some violence too.
Right. But you have this characterization of this person who is again not just an explorer. He's not just this liberal guy who has these this humanistic belief that there's really not that much difference between me and these Aboriginal people. But literally a filmmaker. How much more explicit that can you get of this is the perspective of the people making the movie, that this is what this is about. I don't know if the thread is pursued particularly well, because again it really does boil down to the devil woman who needs to be purged in order for the good white people to go back to civilization. But I thought it was fairly interesting, and I don't I don't know what your thoughts on it were, especially in contrast to From Hell It Came.
Well, but it's got more of I think the storyline's better. I think like I said, the only thing that seems to be, but then a lot of films don't. For example, The Postman Always Rings Twice. We still don't know why the young woman's with the heavy set older man. working the store, restaurant, and hotel. I guess it's not but still, it's bothersome that you really don't get any kind of backstory to that. It doesn't really matter though. Somehow she's evil enough to. She says to Burke, the character who plays, the Burke who plays the character of Maxwell. Is that right?
Yeah.
I come with me because I get all his money. Let's kill him. And he says, "What are you, nuts?" It's pretty straightforward, actually. The film. It's not. There's not much subtlety to it.
No.
But that's okay. It's well done.
Yeah. And I think, despite the fact that we don't really get any really insight into her as a character, like, Allison Hayes plays a very good villain in this movie. She's able to endow, like, despite not knowing anything about her, she's able to endow her with a certain amount of, despite the fact that she is just totally narcissistically driven, it does make you ask the question of, like, well, how did this woman come to be in this place where, like, she is now literally the queen, the voodoo queen? And this is like, and actually, it is Gogi who is the black manservant of the white filmmakers. He literally identifies her, that's the voodoo queen. And so you have to wonder, is like, this isn't an act for her. It's not a mask. And the fact that it is made explicit that the voodoo is real.
Yes.
There is this aspect of society that white people and civilization just don't understand. And it's almost like a Heart of Darkness narrative. And even Metz gets into it. Like, he's having a conversation with Maxwell about, like, what the difference is between psychology and superstition. And he just sort of, like, he's very dismissive of even the premise of, like, trying to psychoanalyze it.
You were asking about voodoo, Mr. Maxwell. If I were you, I shouldn't become too curious about it.
Why is that, Doctor?
Some things better left unexplored unless one is prepared to face danger unnecessarily.
But surely, Doctor, a man of your intelligence and background can't accept a savage superstition.
Superstition?
Well, that one could kill a man by actually sticking pins in a doll.
There's much more to it than that, Mr. Maxwell. The basis of voodoo goes back over 2,000 years. To the Pythagoreans.
The Pythagoreans? Weren't they the ones that believed in metempsychosis? The transmigration of personality?
That's correct.
And you believe, Doctor, that through death, the personality can be transferred from another human being?
I have no beliefs on that subject, Mr. Maxwell. Only observations.
He's very much just like, well, people have been. He brings up the idea of metempsychosis, which is what serves in the plot. This idea that you can take someone else's body and use it as the vessel. That's the other thing I should have mentioned, is that, like, the reason she sacrifices the manservant Suba, it doesn't just cure Joe, the guy who was injured by the lion. Suba's spirit literally possesses him.
Right. So much that the wife takes him in.
So much that the wife takes him in, and he basically becomes her slave. It's this, and there's this weird energy, and it's like, and that's another aspect of it, like, obviously this tension that the movie is playing upon, and why there needs to be this ideological safety valve of, she's just evil, she's just demonic, she's just narcissistically driven, because at the heart of it, like, there's this whole scene in the beginning where Suba is basically, like, Goji's parallel. What Goji is for the white filmmakers as just this dutiful servant, he'll do anything for them. Suba is that for the Metz family. But the difference is, because there's a woman in the equation, Suba looks on this woman who he knows, you're trying to kill Buana. You're trying to kill Master. You don't care about him. You're a bad woman. And then she has this whole seductive thing where it's like, well, I think you like bad woman. And she kisses him and then slaps him across the face. But presumably, even unto death, even unto his soul entering into the body of this other man, he's still, like, devoted to her. And so really, at the end of the day, like the symbolic narrative of this movie is of a young white woman in a relationship with an older man who is totally unhappy, but who learns to identify with a colonized culture and attempts to use that identification in order to strike back at her husband. So maybe that's a potential oppositional reading, that the way of looking at it is that this is a veiled portrayal of what the real danger is. The real danger is that the white woman will end up with this brown-skinned man and identify with these brown-skinned people, and they will rise up and they will, take back the land from the, the white person who has, no reason to be there. And
right.
he basically is just living parasitically, because, he has a lot of wealth, but,
Yeah, to them it's
how does
not,
he, yeah,
right.
how does he communicate with society? There are clearly people living on his property. Suba is living on his property. And it's never asked, wait, what does Suba get paid? What are these people doing there? What is their actual...
What's your bartering?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You basically, you can only conclude that, and this is the thing. This is
they go down to the bank at the corner,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It goes back to From Hell It Came, where it's this American perspective of just flattening all historical context, so that you are just presented with, as if it's natural, as if this white guy just grew out of the ground and is just better than these African people. Then what actually happened is no, this one guy is part of a long history of these people coming to these lands and colonizing and having a totally extractive and coercive relationship. But we can't tell that story. So maybe the way we tell it is we launder it through this veiled narrative of the evil.
Yeah, because obviously he lives happily ever after she's dead.
Yeah.
Right? He's sitting back there. You can go now because I'm fine.
Yeah, you got rid of that. Good job putting down that slave revolt for me, boys. I really appreciate that. That'll teach them. But definitely, I would definitely. It's weird. It's weird because From Hell It Came, I think I enjoyed it more just because it was so blackly comic, just from a perspective.
It's more topical, if you will. There's not really much depth to it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it over the Disembodied. And I think it is a shame that, the Disembodied isn't remembered as much. Because it's while neither film is particularly great, I might be more inclined to recommend the Disembodied over it, just because it just is the technically better made film. And it seems to be a much more personal project, because, again, it just doesn't feel like anything that was made in the late 50s. It feels like a throwback to, a much more atmospheric, sort of thriller that you would see in the 30s and 40s.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. It seems like it was an attempt. It's not an attempt. It's just the way it came out. It seems like I don't know if it's necessarily a throwback. There are more recent things that have that same kind of, almost that same kind of structure. Here it happens to be true voodoo. But you see that again and again in a number of films. The Four Skulls of Jonathan Drake. It's voodoo. Right? His head is attached to a body of a native, and he gets life through that. And
there again, we have another sort of veiled imagery of white meeting black, of the flesh being intermingled.
They have to separate the head from the body in order to
in order to save
there's a curse there, right? So the family has to be killed, right? The Four Skulls have to do with I don't know exactly why the Drakes are why they need.
Well, it's been a while. I haven't even seen the movie.
Yeah, but it's very similar. Or you get to Midnight in the Garden of Eden, the film by Clint Eastwood.
I've never even heard
Kevin
of that.
Spacey's in it, and it's somewhat about voodoo, but it really isn't voodoo. But this woman that lives there, who's a voodoo-like kind of woman, knows everything about, what's the other thing for voodoo? Santeria. Santeria, and Santeria, whatever. I don't know the depth of it. But
please don't say nuke 'em all. Please, I really don't want this podcast to end on that note.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that was a good talk.
Good.
So would you say recommend both movies?
I would recommend both. But
see them together or separate?
Well, since we talked about them together, people should see them together and see if they get the same.
Yeah, that's your homework. There you go.
Yeah, they're very short. One's an hour 15 minutes.
That is the other thing. We should have talked about. We should have talked about the beauty of that is one of the beauty of the old B movies, is that the economy to them was not just that they were cheap to make. The economy to them was that they were short and to the point. We can't have that anymore. I'm sorry, people, but like this is a bad thing, and like it gets back to our whole point about like the lack of diversity in filmmaking now, and the so much consolidation of resources, and this is what happens: is that we now have, you know, major blockbuster movies that are dominating the market, and all of them are bordering on 3 hours. I'm sorry, it's not.
Well, a lot of it has to do, and we talked about this before, a lot of it has to do with less dialogue and more action or more visual effects to carry the movie. And so you need more time for that.
Not always, though. Like if you watch any of these like modern Marvel movies, or not even a Marvel movie, just like any superhero movie, they just talk your head off. So many of them are just...
No, that's true.
Like it seems, but we shouldn't get like on a whole rant about
that's
that.
That's a whole tape.
Yeah, that's for another day. Happy Halloween, everybody.
Happy Halloween.